Welcome to the Rural Social Worker Closing the Gaps Despite the Distance podcast. I am your host, Andrea Charles, and this is the space where we will delve into the heart of rural landscapes and explore the essential role of social workers in bridging the gaps in rural social work. Join me as we navigate the unique challenges, celebrate the triumphs, and uncover the stories that shape the fabric of rural life. Together, let's embark on a journey to understand the transformative impact of social workers in the forgotten communities of our nation. A quick note, while our discussions provide valuable insight, please remember that this podcast is not a substitute for official supervision or guidance in your professional practice. Welcome to episode 6, Rural Culture, Social Work Struggles. In this episode, I have my friend Dr. Nancy Rockowitz on here, and I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself.
Hi. So like you said, Dr. Nancy Rockowitz, I am a doctor of social work. I own Boyd Lake Counseling, but prior to owning my own practice, I was a school social worker in what was at one point the poorest town in the state of Maine. And I was a social worker there for 3 years. I worked primarily with children and their families, which I, in many capacities, have been doing for over 30 years as a daycare provider, a teacher, and then a social worker. So it kind of came naturally to me to start working with kiddos in a school from teaching.
Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about culture in rural communities, but I want you to tell me a little bit about the town that you worked in that was the small town in Maine that you were talking about.
So Guilford, Maine, as of July 2024, has a total population of 1,295 people. There was 873 families. Let's see. So there were 454% of people owned their homes, 23% rented, and there was 21% actually just vacant homes. The median home income, the median home value was $185,000. The average home value was $238,000, but the median household income was only $50,000 a year, and the average was $66,000, and that was in 2024.
That's insane.
Yeah, it was. It's pretty low, and the percentage of income per mortgage was 23%, and the per capita income was only just under $33,000 a year.
What was it like working in a school? How big was the school that you worked in there?
It was. I worked in the middle and high school. Well, actually, there was. The elementary, middle, and high school. So the elementary school and the middle school were combined. And then the high school was just around the corner. They shared, the parking lots were connected. They didn't necessarily share them, but the parking lots were connected. The school wasn't very big. You knew everybody. You knew all the kids, and all the kids knew each other. The classroom sizes were fairly small, maybe 15 kids per classroom. And a lot of the teachers had been there for quite some time, and most of the people were big parts of their community. It was a small area. It was a small town. So everybody knew everybody.
Yeah, which is very common in rural communities, and culture in rural communities is very different because you're not looking at different races, religions, ethnicities. You're looking at, a lot of poverty, a lot of, Caucasian populations. Sounds like the majority of this town was poverty stricken.
Yeah, the town was 95% Caucasian. But the vast difference was the income levels. That was really your cultural shift, was your income levels. The people that lived in poverty did not trust the people that did not live in poverty, and they really struggled there was a lot of DCYF calls. There was a lot of DCYF involvement. So people that were in poverty had a very, very strong mistrust of anybody in authority.
Uh-huh. One thing that really bothers me that I talk a lot about is our lack of preparation in school for working in these communities with this population. Do you feel you were at all prepared in school to work with this population?
So because I taught in that district, I actually was a paraprofessional in that same district years
Mhm.
before. And then I had worked in a couple of other districts that were also very high on the poverty scale or very low on the poverty scale. And so working in that school did come fairly naturally. The only difference was as a teacher, I had a different position than as a social worker. And believe it or not, as a social worker, I was less trusted because social workers were acquainted or correlated with DCYF.
What did you have to do to kind of change, or were you successful at changing that stigma around social workers coming into a school and their relationship with DCYF?
I don't think I changed it very much. I worked really hard. One of the biggest problems was it was like the Hatfields and McCoys often. So one family was always reporting the other family. They would call me up and they were always
Mhm.
reporting, oh, she's doing this, or this person's selling drugs here, or that person's selling their medication on the Lynx bus, which was a transportation bus. And there was a lot of reporting to me, which was difficult because I was told at that time. So in Maine, because it's such a rural community and because there's such a dearth of social workers, our supervisors didn't have to be trained. So my supervisor had gotten her license like after she was hired to be my supervisor. So she had no supervisory experience or training. So she told me that if something was reported to me, a parent reported something, that I was not allowed to report it to DCYF. And I was also told that I was not allowed to report anything to DCYF unless I went through her. So she was extremely unprepared and untrained. So there was a lot of conflict going on. In addition to that, the supervisor knew people in the town and also would talk about all the families and how they're connected and how, this person is that person's parental figure. And she would the gossip was very thick, so it was really difficult to navigate who to call, when to report, what was reportable, and even the medication provider was so there were so many kids that were so abused with so many medications because there was nobody there to really collaborate or do anything. So knowing when to call DCYF, when not to call DCYF, and having any kind of relationship with DCYF was extremely difficult, and there was no way to navigate that. So in Massachusetts, for instance, if you call DCYF, they send someone to the home, they provide
Mhm.
family therapy, they provide individual therapy, they provide mentors to the kids. In Maine, when you would call DCYF, they would go into the home, they would investigate, they would sometimes remove children. There were many children that had been removed and put back over and over again. So it was an extremely difficult task, and I'm not sure I accomplished any kind of cohesiveness between DCYF and myself and the families during that time.
Sounds like it would be hard to make any sort of impact or do anything productive in a situation like that.
It was extremely difficult. I was able to open lines of communication between the school and the parents because at the
Mhm.
time the parents didn't trust the school and the school didn't trust the parents. The school, the children would do things in school, um, things that were very difficult to navigate, trash classrooms, things like that, and harm teachers, and the parents weren't even called. And I would say to the principal, well, didn't you call the parent? Well, it's useless to call them. They don't do anything. So it's a very small town. They all had there was a lot of conflict between between the school and the families, and then the families with each other. It was very difficult to navigate in Guilford.
Mhm. How did you work on, one thing that I know in rural communities specifically, outsiders are not welcome, new people aren't wanted. How did you work to build that trust?
Respecting boundaries. I really needed to respect. For instance, we talked before. I had a child who had been pulled out of his home so many times by DCYF that I started to take notes during a session, and he grabbed my notes, ripped them up, put them in a cup of water, stirred them around, took them into the bathroom, and flushed them down the toilet. So I had to learn to respect the boundaries of the kiddos that were afraid. So I didn't take notes during sessions anymore. I stopped doing that completely. As far as, the school, I started to work with the school and the parents together to put them together. I did a lot of Oreo cooking. So I would call up and I would say something positive, and then I would say whatever happened, and then I would say something positive after that. And I would always have empathy for the families. Hey, I know that you've got a lot going on. I know that you're really struggling. I know that having, your child get a call from school about your child can be very difficult for you. So this is what's happening. And, how can I help you? How can I make this better? And what was interesting was towards the end, I remember one situation where there was a young man who was getting suspended quite often. I really liked this kid, and he had a very, very difficult life, very difficult. And I remember the principal came to me and said, we have to suspend him. And whenever they would suspend him, it was a big ordeal. Well, I gained his trust over time. And a lot of it was food, believe it or not. I always had food. Always. I still remember that same child came out of the gym one day, walked by me, and he said, I just want to let you know, I went in your office and I got some crackers. I didn't touch anything. I swear. He said, but he had to get something to eat before he went to practice because he didn't have any food. And, the school lunch wasn't enough. So I remember they said to me, will you go tell him he's suspended? Because they didn't want to tell him. They were afraid. So I brought him in the office. He says, what? He said, I got to get to gym class. And I said, well, we need to talk. And he said, okay, what? And I said, you're being suspended. And I told him what it was for. And he slammed the desk, flipped the chair over, and went and sat in the corner quietly. And I just sat very quiet. And when it was done, he was done. And he looked at me and he said, can I go to gym class before I get suspended? Because I'm in the thing and I need to get done. And I said, do you swear we're going to do the right things in gym class? He goes, I swear it. And he did. He went to gym class and I went and peeked in the window and made sure everything was okay. And then it was the first time ever when he was done, he walked into the office. He owned what he had done. They gave him the suspension and he went home for the day. And I had earned his trust. So I was able to deliver that news. He was able to accept that news. He was able to take responsibility for his actions. And the school was pretty amazed that he had grown so much. But I think somewhere along the way, a lot of those kids got a bullseye on their backs. They were the bad kids. And nobody ever really saw that they could be so much more.
I think in rural communities, it's hard, whatever you did in, first, second grade, it carries with you so much into the future. And it's hard for teachers to forget because everybody knows everybody, right? And so they talk and then the teachers talk to the next year's teacher. And it's hard to get away from the reputation you had when you were younger because of that.
And not only that, but it was funny because I was a paraprofessional in that same school years before. And one of the children I also had her mother. So a lot of these people stay in the town. They don't ever leave the town. These kids have never been out of their town. So a lot of these kids are brought, their parents went and then they went. And in small communities, that last name really follows you everywhere. So,
did you live in that community you worked in or just work there?
I lived about 20 minutes away from there.
Okay.
So I didn't live far from there, but the communities, so these were all small communities. And so I lived in a community that did not have a lot of poverty. But all the communities around it did. So I traveled just for 20 minutes, but in 20 minutes time, you could see the difference in the homes and the crime rates. And it was a big difference just 20 minutes down the road.
Yeah. Did they treat you differently because you did not live in that community?
No, I don't think that they really knew, and I don't think that the kids knew, and I don't think that the parents knew. The teachers knew, but in the same sense, the teachers also didn't live in the poverty either. So I was accepted by the teachers, but believe it or not, the teachers that were for the kids accepted me widely. They were
Mhm.
very happy I was there. They were always willing to work with me. But the teachers that wanted to target the kids, unfortunately, there were some that were part of the community that really struggled with seeing these kids as being more and understanding their trauma. People don't realize that poverty is trauma, and they don't see that. And they don't see that having 8 kids in a 2-bedroom house that have 4 different fathers and in many abusive relationships, they can't see that these children need a little bit more care
Mhm.
and they want them to follow the rules. And those teachers had the most problem with me because I was advocating so much for the children.
Yeah, that'd be frustrating.
It was. It was that mostly.
And in a lot of rural communities, I talk about how getting engaged in the community is key to kind of getting in the community. But when you have such a small community that's such high poverty, there isn't a lot of things to engage in the community with. They don't have the parades or the committees or the volunteer organizations that they do in, less poverty stricken communities. So being part of the school is a way of being involved in the community because the school is such a pivotal part of it.
Right. They did try. Um, they did. Their sports teams had a really good following. A lot of the parents came out, but a lot of these kids that struggled weren't on the sports teams. And I think that that's a big problem in rural communities is we've done away with all the things that most of the children that I work with, especially the young boys, love to work on their cars. They love to work on trucks. They love to go out and go on dirt roads and have a good time. And these aren't the kids that played baseball. These aren't the kids that played that ran. Well, our school didn't have a track. We had a track team, but we couldn't run on the track because it was broken. We didn't have a football team, but we did have a softball and baseball team and soccer. But a lot of these kids didn't do those things. And somewhere along the way, we've stopped with auto shop and we've stopped with the different clubs that kids really enjoyed doing that they could connect. And I think a lot of the kids that didn't play sports or they couldn't because of financial reasons, they didn't have anywhere to connect. So they didn't feel like they were part of the community. And I think that made them more ostracized and caused more behaviors.
Yeah. And, looking back in your experience, I mean, you've worked there. I wanted to talk a little bit about your supervisory experience. As a young social worker in a community, you touched on it a little bit, but we rely so much on our supervisors for advice and for how to move forward. And it sounds like you did not have that at all.
No. So the first supervisor I had was actually a friend, and she worked there, of course, dual relationship. She was my neighbor. Her husband was my black belt instructor, so it's a very close community. And she loved me. We did so much work together. And the person, actually, the man that ran the large organization that I was working with, he was married to her at one time. So you want to talk about some close knit relationships. And he actually hugged me and told me I was a miracle worker for getting this program up and running in this school. And she left. And when she left, this young woman came in. She was about 24 years old, had just graduated with her social work degree, and the 2 years prior had not even taken her test yet to pass her exams to get her licensed social work, her licensure. And she became my supervisor before she was ever even licensed. And she was trying to fit the role without understanding that an administrative supervisor instead of a teaching supervisor. So I had because there was such, again, that dearth of social workers, I had no supervisor other than an administrative supervisor. There was no one there to guide me. And she, just like others, because she was young, would start talking about the families and the dysfunctional parts of the families. And that was very uncomfortable for me, trying to set clear boundaries, not only with her, but with the people that I worked with. I didn't need to know the intimate details of their lives if they weren't willing to share them. But because it was such a small community, everybody knew everybody's business. And as inexperienced as she was sharing very intimate details about these families. And that was difficult. It's hard to have that almost dual relationship knowledge without having the dual relationship and still be able to function within really clear cut boundaries. Because now you know things that you shouldn't have known.
Yeah. For new social workers who maybe not know the difference between administrative supervision and social work supervision, what is the difference between those two?
Social work supervision should be a very non confrontational. It should be a safe space. It should be a place where you go and you express, I don't know what I'm doing in this situation, ask for help. They should be observing some of your interactions with people. They should be coming in and having you have a safe space to talk. And the administrative supervision, it was extremely uncomfortable. She was doing my evaluations. She was writing me up for things. I couldn't tell her anything. Um, she didn't guide me in any way, shape, or form. If I was doing something that wasn't correct, there was no guidance. It was a write up.
Mm-hmm.
Like I called DCYF one time and she wrote me up because she said that I should have asked her first before calling DCYF. And I went over her head. So I wasn't being guided in any way, shape, or form. It was just like having a boss that was punishing me for doing things wrong. And being a new social worker, being unlicensed at the time, just being a conditional social worker, it was extremely difficult to try to navigate things then on my own because I was afraid to tell her anything. And that's not the way it should be in a social work supervisor. Now, if you have an administrative supervisor, of course, that's the way it can be. But having someone that sits and talks to you and helps you and guides you is so important to find in a supervisory relationship.
Was this the majority of your supervision, or did you get additional supervision after you left this small community, or were you licensed by the time you ended?
When I left there, that was the only supervisor that I had. And there actually were meetings that I went to with the school, with her there, that she refused to count as supervision, even though she was present and I was working with the school in a group to try and navigate some of the things that were happening. When I left there, because she refused, I still had several hours left. So I moved to New Hampshire because we were moving for my spouse's job. I still had, I believe, 19 hours left that I needed to get my license. And I had new supervisors. They were more of a safe space to land. They were more experienced, but they were also very non-interested. So they weren't super helpful, but they didn't make me feel like I couldn't talk to them. I felt like I could talk to them, and they did give some guidance. And there were no write-ups and things like that. There was no administrative action. So I was allowed to talk freely with these supervisors for that last 19 hours.
In the small community I know technology is not what it is today, obviously, but were you able to seek outside supervision, or were you forced to have that supervisor and only that supervisor?
I did not know that I could seek outside supervision. At the time in New Hampshire, I probably could have. Now, in New Hampshire at this time, New Hampshire has passed a law because I moved to New Hampshire. New Hampshire did pass a law stating that any supervisor you have as a conditional license has to be an employee of wherever you're working. You can't seek outside supervision for licensure hours.
That could create some barriers, it seems like.
So that's in New Hampshire, but in Maine, you can still seek out and you don't have to. So I am a certified supervisor in the state of New Hampshire, and I have supervised people in the state of Maine because the state of Maine does allow outside supervisors that you don't even have to have training, but I do have it. So yes, it can be very difficult. With the first situation, that was the only supervisor I had, and I was not allowed to go over her head. She was, like I said, very, very regimented. She was very disciplinary over me. So I had no opportunity to really work with anyone else at that time.
If you could go back or were in that situation again, or somebody who's in that situation and can seek outside supervision, what do you think is the best way to seek that and to find those people that can be supportive, to find those supports?
So I definitely would advise anybody to join collaboration groups. I belong to a collaboration group now. I absolutely love it. You can go, there's a New Hampshire and Maine Facebook page. I'm sure many, many states have these Facebook pages, and you can find supervision there. Find people, find collaboration groups, join collaboration groups. Maybe you won't get your hours for that supervisory experience as a conditional because you have to be approved, but at least you're having a place where you can talk to people freely, openly, and say, I'm frustrated or I don't know what to do. And because there's because of the lack of supervisors in Maine, I can tell you, one person I did supervise in Maine, their cases were, as a conditionally supervised person, their cases were harder than some of the cases I would take. They're being overrun with cases that are very, very difficult, and they need a place where they can talk about these things and get feedback. So I would advise anyone to find collaboration groups and engage in them as often as possible. I engage in weekly collaboration with a group of people online.
Kind of detouring a little bit from supervision, but I'm curious what working in a school like that or with that population did for your own mental health and burnout levels, and how it made you feel as just as a social worker and a person in general, because it sounds like it would be very frustrating.
When I walked in as a conditional social worker in my second year of my master's program, my senior year of my master's program, there were 2 cases that I saw those children. And because of confidentiality, I can't explain, but there were some serious legal things that were happening that those children were involved in. There was some significant trauma in those families that involved death, that involved violence, significant violence. And without any experience, I walked into that. And I saw 2 children from 2 different families that experienced those pretty significant things. And burnout, the frustration of working with some teachers who didn't have the children's best interest in mind, that wanted to dominate them, force them to follow rules, challenge them, and having to navigate that and support the children while not getting in trouble with the teachers really did become very overwhelming. And I would cry. I would leave there. There would be a lot of tears, trying to, just out of frustration, because I had no supervisor to talk to. I had no one to let this out. I had no one to navigate this with. And people were getting angry with me from every avenue. The teachers were getting angry, and my supervisor was getting angry, and I was no longer the hero, as the former supervisor had stated. I was then the bad guy, and I became very frustrated and very overwhelmed. It was very, very difficult to continue to do that, but I also became very enmeshed in the community, and I didn't want to leave because I was afraid for them because I cared so much about the kids. And when you start to care that much and you go to their families' homes, there was more than one family that I went there that I would text home and say, I'm going in this house now and I'll let you know when I come out. There was a lot of violence and so it did become very overwhelming. And without that outlet, without a supervisor to talk to, the only place to talk about it was in therapy, and every therapist should have a therapist because place you can talk confidential about confidential information.
Yeah. And I think there's still quite a stigma around that of social work or therapists in general, or anybody getting therapy, even though we offer it for people, there's still, and especially in a small community. And back then there wasn't telehealth. There wasn't the option to be, have that anonymity. And so it makes it hard. Now it's a little bit easier. I have a therapist and she's on the other side of the state and, isn't involved in anything in the place that I live, which makes it a little bit easier because then if you have local trainings and stuff, you're not showing up and seeing them for everything. So, now we have so much technology and so much advancement, and we can actually, seek supervision online. We can seek therapy online, and we can do that and have that anonymity piece, which I think is so hard in small communities.
So, yes, funny story. When I was working in that school as a social worker, we had to call crisis, and a woman came in, and it was my therapist's wife. That's how close this community was.
Yeah.
And, when I was in grad school, they said, who doesn't have a therapist? And if you don't have one, to get one. So, of course, I did so. And I remember I went to breakfast. So this is a very small area. I went to breakfast at a local place, and in walks my therapist and his wife. And the wife didn't know that he was my therapist. And she came over to talk to me about the case at the school. So this was dual relationships in this community were completely unavoidable. You just could not avoid them in any way, shape, or form.
And navigating those can be difficult too, and you're caught off guard, or it's an uncomfortable situation or whatever it is.
Yeah. And, she didn't know, he didn't let on, and I didn't let on. And we all had very, very clear boundaries, but just that, coming in and walking right over to my table with my spouse there and having a conversation about something that had happened at the school, that was a little bit uncomfortable.
I bet. So. Yeah, dual relationships. I'm sure you saw a lot more than just that in far as dual relationships, and even going to their homes. That's not something in urban communities. You don't really see social workers going to people's homes, and you see that a lot more in rural areas. I had a intake or somebody who wanted therapy, and they're in a facility and they can't get transportation to my office, and I'm like, well, I can come there. But that's not something you do a lot. You don't see that a lot in urban communities because it just traffic or whatever. It's just, you don't get there. And I think it's just the culture too of rural communities is, you're a team and you want to support each other. And so you do those home visits or you do those facility visits because it's important for the relationship.
Right. And a lot of times we did go out to the homes, or I went out to the homes because parents couldn't come in and sign paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
They just couldn't get in. They had no way to get there. They had no one to watch their little kids. They had no transportation. And I would go out to the homes. And then when you go out to the homes, you see these homes. And maybe here where I live in New Hampshire, maybe someone would have called DCYF about these homes. And then you have to navigate that. I'm in this home. Should I call DCYF? How is it going to harm the relationship? Are they really at risk? Do they have food, or do I support them to get food? Do I help them get services? So you have to, being in someone's home changes the relationship in itself. And that can be tedious also.
Yeah. For new social workers or social workers that are not from rural communities, that go into a situation like that, if you could go back and give your younger self advice, what would it be?
Get a support system. Be passionate, but also be equal. Sometimes it becomes very emotional trying to navigate these kids that need so much, and the school system that maybe isn't always being fair to them. Some of it is and some of it isn't. I guess I would tell myself to, again, get collaboration, talk to a lot of people, take your time, think everything you do through, and try to balance yourself to work in the whole system rather than trying to fight parts of the system for the benefit of your population. It just seemed like I was always fighting, and there had to be a better way. But because of my lack of experience, I was naive, I was young, I didn't know how to balance that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what caused me a lot of problems.
Yeah, and that's kind of the goal of this podcast too, is to show that, as lonely as rural areas are, there can be support and there's ways to navigate them in a healthier way and find that support when needed.
Especially now with technology, online, being able to reach out to people from all over, that support is much more readily available than it was when I was first starting out.
Mm-hmm. Before we end, is there anything else you want to add that I didn't ask or you think that listeners need to know about?
Well, I think what's really important to recognize is that people in poverty are a population. They have their own rules. They have their own communities. Even within a community, there's a lot of people that live in poverty that are a subset of the community. And sometimes people don't recognize that. Sometimes people don't recognize that they do have different family and community structures within the community, a community within a community. And we need to recognize that and understand that and see that transgenerational trauma, and learn to navigate that. And I really think that I wish social work schools would focus more on some of these things, because children in poverty, all the statistics show children in poverty are more likely to be medicated. 75% of all children in the foster care system are on psychotropic medications. Most of them are on more than one. And somehow we need to learn to navigate that so that these children aren't being abused, and to understand that they live in their own society and try to become more of a part of that and support them within their environment, and stop trying to pluck them out of it into what we want them to be.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. If there are stories or issues that you face in your practice and you would like me to discuss those on this podcast, please send me a message at theruralsocialworker@gmail.com, and I will be happy to take a look. One of the goals of this podcast is storytelling, and I believe that to be impactful, you need context, and that is where stories come in. They give us something to work with and something to build on. I also believe that stories from multiple different rural communities will offer more information and provide more support to rural social workers everywhere. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this episode and will subscribe for more. Thank you for joining me for another insightful episode of The Rural Social Worker. If you've enjoyed our exploration into the vital work of social work in rural communities, be sure to subscribe, share, and connect with me on social media. Your support helps me continue my mission of closing the gaps and fostering resilience in the places that often go unnoticed. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for official supervision in your professional journey. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and keep making a difference in rural communities.